Lone rancher rescues a hanged Apache girl, only to find the tree is a death trap. The desert didn't forgive. It remembered.
Keep moving.
Cade Mercer knew that truth, the way a man knows his own. Heartbeat quiet, constant, undeniable. He'd been riding the Sonoran Flats for 3 hours, his Morgan gelding picking its way through creosote and barrel cactus when the wind shifted. Rusty's ears flicked forward. The horse smelled it first. Blood. Cade pulled his hat lower, shielding eyes that had seen too much of both war and peace. 42 years old, and every one of them etched into the leather of his face. He'd come west after Shiloh, after watching boys die in mud for land nobody wanted. Out here, at least the dying made sense. Thirst. Heat. Rattlesnakes. Honest killers, all of them. The buzzards circled a quarter-mile ahead, their shadows sliding across red sand like omens. He should have turned back. Instead, he urged Rusty forward, one hand, drifting to the Colt at his hip, not drawing, just remembering it was there. The canyon narrowed walls rising like broken teeth against a sky too blue to be kind. That's when he heard it. Not the wind. Not a coyote. A woman's voice, hoarse and fading. Please, someone, if you're watching from Texas, California, or anywhere the Wild West still lives in your heart, hit that like button and drop a 1-inch the comments. Let's ride this story together. Cade rounded the outcropping and stopped cold. The smell hit him first, copper and rot, sweet decay mixed with something sharper. Fear sweat. The kind that came when the body knew it was dying. Then he saw her. She hung from a lightning-struck cottonwood 15 feet above a dry creek bed. Apache, judging by the beadwork on what remained of her dress, torn, dust-caked, soaked dark with sweat and blood. Her wrists were lashed to the branch above her head, arms stretched so tight her shoulders had dislocated. The rope had rubbed through skin. White bone gleamed at her wrists, stark against bronze flesh. But that wasn't the worst of it. Below her the ground moved. Rattlesnakes. A dozen of them, maybe more, coiled in the shade of the cottonwood's roots, drawn by the blood dripping from her feet by the heat of her dying. They hadn't struck yet, just weighted tongues testing the air patient as stones. One lifted its head, rattles buzzing soft as rain on tin. Another slithered closer, drawn by the scent of torn flesh. The woman's toes hung 6 inches above the largest snake, a diamondback thick as Cade's forearm, its triangular head tracking her every tremor. And above her head, 3 feet from her face, a massive hornet's nest clung to the branch. The insects crawled across her collarbone, her throat, her swollen cheeks. Her left eye was sealed, shut, the skin around it purple and tight as a drumhead. Stings covered her neck in angry welts, each one leaking clear fluid. Anaphylaxis. She had minutes, not hours. Her chest barely moved. Each breath came shallow, wet-labored. Cade's gaze tracked higher, and his jaw tightened. The rope wasn't just rope. It was rigged through a pulley system connected to a smoke canister, wedged in the tree's fork, military issue, the kind used for signaling. Cut her down wrong, and a plume would rise visible for 5 miles in every direction. A beacon for whoever had set this trap. And it was a trap, no question. He scanned the rocks. 3 rifle barrels glinted in the afternoon sun, positioned in a loose triangle around the tree. Iron ravens. He'd heard of them, ex-Confederate raiders turned bandits led by a man who wore a colonel's coat like a priest wore vestments. They'd been terrorizing Apache camps for months, burning, looting, taking women. This one they'd hung out like a scarecrow. Cade counted the bones at the tree's base. 2 skeletons half buried in sand. Men who'd tried to help before him. Their rib cages were broken, skulls shattered. They'd been beaten to death slowly, methodically. A warning. Buzzards circled overhead, their shadows crossing the woman's face like dark prayers. The woman's head lolled forward. Her lips moved, blood trickling from the corner of her mouth. She was speaking Apache words he didn't know. Prayer maybe, or curse. Then English, barely a whisper. Leave me. Her good eye opened. Black, furious, unbroken despite everything. They're watching, she whispered, each word costing her. Waiting. 3 in the rocks. More coming at sunset. Go now. Even dying, she was trying to save him. Cade's hands tightened on his rifle. He'd seen torture before Andersonville, Cold Harbor, places where men became devils. But this was different. This was calculated. The hornets to speed her death. The snakes to prevent rescue from below. The smoke canister to catch anyone who tried. Someone had spent hours rigging this, had enjoyed it. The woman's eye closed. Her body sagged and the rope creaked. One of the snakes struck at her, shadow fangs clacking against stone. Cade had 2 choices. Ride away. Live another day. Let the desert claim one more body. Or choose fire. He chose fire. Cade backed Rusty behind the outcropping out of sight and rifle range, then tied the gelding to a Joshua tree. The horse nickered softly, ears flat. He smelled death, wanted to run. Easy boy, Cade murmured, stroking the animal's neck. I'll be back, probably. He stripped off his coat and shirt, hanging them on the saddle horn. The sun bit into his shoulders, immediately turning his skin red good. He'd need to move fast, and cloth could catch on branches, slow him down, get him killed. From his saddlebag, he pulled supplies: a tin of kerosene, a box of matches, a coil of rope, and the bow. He'd taken off a dead Comanche 2 years back. Most men out here carried only guns, but Cade had learned silence was worth more than firepower. You couldn't track a man by the sound of an arrow. His hands moved with the muscle memory of a man who'd rigged demolitions during the war, back when blowing bridges meant saving lives instead of taking them. He soaked his bandana in kerosene until it dripped, wrapped it tight around an arrow shaft, and struck the match. The cloth caught instantly, flame-licking blue-orange in the dry air, heat shimmering. The fire smelled like home, like the lamps his wife used to light before the fever took her and their daughter both. Cade shook off the memory. The dead couldn't help him now. He knocked the burning arrow to his bow, 60-pound draw, enough to punch through a man at 100 yards, and aimed not at the ravens but at the scrub. Oak 50 yards to their left, upwind, dry as kindling. He exhaled slowly, steadying his aim, then released. The arrow sailed true, trailing smoke like a comet, and buried itself deep in dead brush. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the fire exploded. Desert dry wood and wind did the rest. Flames leaped 20 feet high, roaring like a living thing. Within seconds, smoke billowed thick and black, rolling across the canyon floor in a choking wave. The rifle barrels shifted, tracking the new threat north, away from the tree. Cade heard voices shouting, confused, angry. Fire, who checked the ridge? It's spreading. Perfect. Cade moved. He sprinted, low boots, silent on sand, despite his speed closing the distance to the cottonwood in heartbeats. 50 yards. 40. 30. The hornets buzzed louder, agitated by the smoke, by the vibrations of his approach. The rattlesnakes scattered, disappearing into crevices, fleeing the fire's roar and the pounding of his boots. The woman's eye tracked him through the smoke. Fool, she breathed, her voice barely audible over the fire's crackle. Probably, Cade agreed and started climbing. The cottonwood's bark was smooth as bone, sap-slick and treacherous. Cade's boots slipped twice in the first 6 feet. He compensated with his hands gripping hard enough that splinters drove under his nails, drawing blood. Every movement sent tremors through the branch where she hung. The hornets rose in a furious cloud, their buzz deepening from hum to scream, a sound like tearing metal, like rage given voice. One stung his neck just below his ear, then his shoulder, then his forearm. Fire spread beneath his skin, venom pumping through muscle, but he kept climbing. Pain was nothing. Pain was just the body complaining. He'd learned to ignore it at Shiloh when he'd carried a wounded sergeant 3 miles with a bayonet still stuck in his thigh. At 12 feet, he paused to catch his breath, pressing his face against the trunk. The smoke was thicker here, burning his eyes, coating his throat. Below, through the haze, he saw the ravens emerging from the rocks, 3 men moving toward the fire with rifles raised. They hadn't seen him yet. The smoke was his ally. For now, Cade climbed higher. 15 feet. The branch groaned under his weight and hers combined. The woman hung 2 feet away, close enough to touch. Her head lolled to the side, and he saw the full extent of her injuries: rope, burns at her wrists, where bone showed through hornet stings, covering her throat, and chest bruises, shaped like fingerprints on her arms, and on her left shoulder blade, half hidden by torn fabric, a brand. 2 crossed feathers burned into flesh, the iron raven's mark. They'd branded her before hanging her out as bait. Cade's vision went red at the edges. Rage, cold and pure, settled into his chest. He forced it down. Anger made men sloppy. Anger got you killed. At the pulley, he paused. The smoke canister was wired with fishing line, thin, nearly invisible, wrapped 3 times around the trigger mechanism. Cut it wrong and the whole thing would blow. The smoke would rise, the ravens would see, and both he and the woman would die. Cade pulled his knife, a 9-inch Bowie with a blade he'd sharpened that morning on Riverstone, and studied the wiring. 3 wraps meant 3 cuts, precisely timed, precisely placed. His hands didn't shake. They never did when it mattered. First cut through the outer wrap. The line parted with a soft ping. Second cut through the middle wrap. The canister shifted, caught, held. Third cut, gunfire erupted below. A bullet whined past Cade's head so close, he felt the heat of its passage so close his ear rang from the sonic crack. The ravens had spotted him through the smoke. "Hold still," Cade growled at the woman sawing through the final wrap and the main rope in one desperate stroke. "I wasn't planning to dance." She shot back, voice rough but sharp, defiant even now, even dying. The line parted. The canister fell harmlessly into the creek bed below, clattering against stones. The rope parted. She dropped like a cut marionette. Cade lunged, catching her with one arm, while his other hand locked around the branch. Her weight solid muscular, not the frail captive he'd expected, nearly tore him loose. His shoulder screamed, tendons stretching to the breaking point. They swung together, a pendulum of sweat and blood and hornet venom, while bullets chewed the air around them. Wood splintered. Hornets screamed. The branch cracked ominously. Cade didn't wait for it to break. He dropped her the last 6 feet. She hit the ground, rolling even with dislocated shoulders. Even with venom shutting down her system, she moved like a warrior. She came up in a crouch, good arm reaching for a rock for anything she could use as a weapon. Cade landed beside her in a spray of sand, grabbed her good arm and ran. Behind them, the ravens' voices rose in fury. Their north side. Don't let them kill them both. But the smoke was thick as wool now, and Cade knew this canyon. He'd scouted it 2 days ago, marking every boulder, every crevice, every possible escape route. He pulled the woman into the smoke, into the maze of stone, into the wild country where maps meant nothing, and only the desert decided who lived and who fed the buzzards. They had maybe 5 minutes before the ravens organized a pursuit. Cade intended to use every second. The smoke was their ally now, thick as wool, blinding. It rolled through the canyon like a living thing, swallowing shapes, muffling sound, turning the world into a gray hell where every shadow could be death. They crashed through it, Cade half dragging the woman her feet, leaving bloody prints in the sand. Each step painted the story of their flight, smeared red, then fading to rust, then disappearing into smoke. Behind them, voices shouted, 3, maybe 4 men coordinating. "North Ridge," one yelled, voice sharp with authority. "A leader. Cut them off at the wash. Check the rocks, they can't have gone far." Cade's mind raced, mapping terrain he'd scouted 2 days ago. The wash was east exposed. The North Ridge would take too long to climb. But the boulder field, that maze of broken stone where a man could vanish, if he knew the paths, that was southeast, maybe 200 yards, if they could reach it. The woman stumbled, her weight suddenly dead against his arm. She went to one knee, hard gasping. Blood leaked from her wrists where the rope had cut to bone, each drop hissing as it hit hot sand. He yanked her upright more roughly than he intended. "Keep moving. Can't breathe." Her voice was a rasp, barely human. Her lips were turning blue, the color spreading like ink in water. The venom was winning, shutting down her lungs one breath at a time. Cade didn't answer. He half carried, half dragged her toward the boulders, his own lungs burning from smoke and exertion. 20 more yards. 15. His boot slipped on loose shale and they both nearly went down. He caught his balance, kept moving. 10 yards. A rifle cracked behind them. The bullet struck stone 3 feet to their left, throwing up a spray of rock dust. The woman flinched but didn't cry out. 5 yards. They crashed into the boulder field, and Cade hauled her into the rocks, shoving her into a narrow cleft barely wide enough for her shoulders. She wedged in tight back, pressed against cold stone, chest heaving. He pressed his back against the stone beside her, blocking the opening with his body. His hands moved by instinct, reloading his Colt by feel not sight. 6 bullets slid into the cylinder with soft clicks. He counted them twice to be sure. 6 shots. 4 men he'd seen, maybe more he hadn't. The math wasn't good. Boot heels crunched on gravel close now, maybe 20 feet away. Cade's thumb rested on the Colt's hammer, ready to pull it back. One shot would give their position away. One shot might be all they needed, or all they'd get. A shadow passed the opening, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a black duster with something painted on the back. Through the smoke, Cade caught a glimpse, an iron raven wings, spread beak open. The symbol was crude but clear. The man paused, head turning, scanning. Cade held his breath, every muscle locked. Beside him, the woman's chest hitched, a wheeze building deep in her throat. The sound of airways, closing of a body drowning in itself. If she coughed, they were dead. Cade moved on instinct. He clamped his hand over her mouth, felt the heat of her fever through his palm, burning 104 at least, maybe higher. Her skin was slick with sweat. Her body trembled like a horse on the edge of panic. Her eye, the one that wasn't swollen shut, met his. black as river stones, wide with fear but sharp with understanding. She knew what was at stake, knew that one sound would kill them both. In that eye, Cade saw something he recognized: a soldier's discipline. The ability to hurt and stay silent. She didn't cough. The wheeze built rattling in her chest like stones in a jar, but she clamped it down. Her jaw muscles bunched under his palm. Sweat ran down her temples, but she didn't make a sound. The shadow moved on. Boots scuffed stone, moving away. Another voice called from farther out. Anything, nothing. Smoke's too thick. They're in the rocks. Has to be. Spread out, check every cleft. We're losing light. If we don't find them before dark, then we track them at first light. They can't have gone far. She's half dead already. Laughter. Cruel, casual. The laughter of men who'd killed before and expected to again. Then the voices faded, searching elsewhere, moving toward the wash like Cade had hoped they would. Minutes crawled past. Cade counted them by his heartbeat, slow, steady, a rhythm he'd learned in the war when staying calm meant staying alive. 1 minute. 2. 5. When he was sure they'd moved beyond earshot, when the only sounds were wind-distant fire and the woman's labored breathing, he released her. She sagged against the rock, gasping. Each breath was a struggle, a wet, rattling thing that spoke of lungs filling with fluid. Her good eye fluttered, unfocused. Need to. Get Venom out, she managed each word, costing her. Cade nodded. He'd seen anaphylaxis before at Andersonville, when a prisoner got stung by wasps and died in 14 minutes, throat swollen shut, skin purple. But he'd also seen Apache medicine work miracles the army doctors called impossible. Had seen a mescalero healer cure a man of snakebite with nothing but herbs and prayer. If she was a medicine woman, maybe she knew something that could save her. Can you ride? He asked. She looked at him like he'd asked if she could fly. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. She tried again, barely. Stand. That wasn't my question. Her eye focused on him, sharpening. Even dying, even broken, there was steel in her. She gave one slow nod. Yes, then we ride. Now. Rusty hadn't moved from the Joshua tree, trained by years of gunfire to stand ground when other horses would bolt. The gelding's ears flicked toward them as Cade approached, but he didn't shy, didn't spook. Good horse. Best Cade had ever owned. He lifted the woman into the saddle, or tried to. The moment he shifted her weight, her dislocated shoulders moved, and she bit back a scream. The sound that escaped was small animal hurt. Her teeth clamped on her lower lip hard enough to draw blood. Sorry, Cade muttered, adjusting his grip, trying to minimize the pain. No good way to do this. She didn't answer. Couldn't probably. But when he finally got her settled in the saddle, she gripped the horn with her good hand, knuckles white. Cade swung up behind her, gathering the reins. His body pressed against her back, feeling every tremor, every struggling breath. Her skin burned through his shirt. Hold on to the horn, he instructed, wrapping one arm around her waist to keep her upright. I don't need. The words cut off. Her body went rigid back, arching, every muscle locking. Convulsion. The venom was attacking her nervous system now, misfiring signals, shutting down piece by piece. Cade didn't wait. He kicked Rusty into a gallop. They rode hard for the foothills, putting distance between them and the ravens. East first away from the wash, then north toward the mountains. Rusty's hooves pounded sand, then stone, then scrub. The gelding's breath came in great heaving gasps, but he didn't slow. The woman's body jerked against Cade's chest muscles, seizing, releasing, seizing again in waves. Each spasm hit like a fist. He held her upright with one arm, the other guiding Rusty, with the reins his knees doing most of the work. He found himself praying to God, to whatever spirits the Apache believed in, to the empty sky. He'd stopped believing after Shiloh, after watching a surgeon saw through a boy's leg while the kid screamed for his mother. But desperation made believers of everyone. Stay with me, he muttered against her hair. Don't you quit. Not after I risk my neck. She didn't answer. Couldn't. But her fingers tightened on the saddle horn. They rode for what felt like hours, but was probably 30 minutes. The sun dropped toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of red and gold, beautiful and merciless. By the time they reached the canyon mouth, she'd gone limp. Dead weight. Cade's heart seized. He pulled Rusty to a stop, pressed his fingers to her throat, searching for a pulse. For a terrible moment he felt nothing. Just hot skin and stillness. Then there, a flutter against his fingertips, faint and erratic, but there, she was alive. Barely. Cade exhaled hard, a sound halfway to a sob. He didn't know this woman, didn't owe her anything, But the thought of failing, of cutting her down only to watch her die anyway, twisted something in his chest. He urged Rusty forward again, gentler now. The gelding was flagging foam at his mouth, but he kept going, loyal to the end. They rode another mile into the foothills before Cade found what he needed. A shallow cave hidden behind a curtain of juniper and manzanita invisible. Unless you knew where to look. He'd used it before during his first winter alone when he'd been running from different ghosts. The cave was maybe 15 feet deep, the floor smooth stone worn by ancient water. Dry, defensible, hidden, good enough. Cade dismounted carefully, then lifted the woman down. She was unconscious now, head lolling, body slack. He carried her inside and laid her on the stone floor as gently as he could. Then finally he got a good look at what he'd saved. She was tall, nearly 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to pull a plow or swing an axe. Not delicate, not fragile. Built for labor, for survival, for war. Her skin was bronze where it wasn't swollen, darker than any white woman's, marked with scars old and new. A knife wound across her ribs, mostly healed but still pink. A bullet graze on her left thigh. Burn marks on her palms, deliberate ritual maybe, or torture. Warrior marks, survivor marks. But her face, even swollen, even half-dead, she was striking. High cheekbones that cast shadows in the fading light. A mouth built for both laughter and orders. Wide, expressive, currently cracked and bleeding. Black hair hung past her shoulders, matted with blood and sand and ash, and around her neck on a leather cord hung a small pouch. Cade recognized the symbols stitched into the leather, geometric patterns in red and black thread shapes that meant healing, protection, spirit. Medicine woman. She hadn't just been bait, she'd been a target. The Ravens had specifically hunted someone with knowledge, with power in her community, which meant she was valuable, which meant they'd come looking. Cade checked her pulse again, still there, still faint, then set to work. He built a small fire near the cave mouth, just enough for light and heat. From his saddlebag he pulled water whiskey, clean cloth, needle and thread. The hornet stings covered her neck and chest like a plague map. Each one was swollen, oozing, angry. He counted 23. Any one of them could kill her. All of them together. The odds weren't good. But Cade had beaten bad odds before. He heated his knife in the fire until the blade glowed red, then began the work of keeping her alive. Outside, the desert darkened. Inside the cave, firelight danced across stone. And somewhere in the woman's medicine pouch, hidden among herbs and stones, lay secrets that would either save her life or make her death mean something. Cade just had to keep her breathing long enough to find out which. Cade built a small fire near the cave mouth, positioning it carefully so the smoke would dissipate before reaching open air. Just enough flame for light and heat, not enough to signal their location to anyone tracking them through the dark. From his saddlebag, he pulled the basics: clean water in a leather canteen, whiskey in a dented flask, a needle and thread. He'd sterilized in flame 3 months ago after stitching a gash in his own thigh. He laid everything out on a flat stone like a surgeon, preparing for war. Because that's what this was. War against venom, against infection, against time. The hornets had stung her maybe 20 times, neck, shoulders, arms, one on her cheek just below the swollen eye. Each site was angry red, raised like small volcanoes, oozing clear fluid that smelled faintly sweet. Poison. He needed to draw the venom out before it spread deeper, before it reached her heart. Cade fed the fire until it burned hot and clean, then held his knife in the flames. The blade was a 9-inch Bowie carbon steel, sharp enough to shave with. He watched it heat from silver to orange to red, the metal glowing like a piece of captured sun. When it was ready, he pulled it out and let it cool just enough that it wouldn't cauterize on contact. Then he began. The first incision was on her neck, just above her collarbone. A small cut, precise, releasing a bead of yellow-green fluid mixed with blood. He squeezed gently, and more venom oozed out, thick, viscous, wrong. She didn't wake, but her body flinched. Her shoulder jerked away from his touch, some deep animal instinct, recognizing pain even through the fog of unconsciousness. A soft sound escaped her throat, not quite a moan, not quite a word. "I know," Cade murmured, though she couldn't hear him. "I know it hurts. But you'll hurt worse if I don't." He moved to the next sting, then the next. Each one the same cut, squeeze, wipe clean with whiskey-soaked cloth. The smell of alcohol mixed with venom, creating something acrid that burned his nose. His hands stayed steady. They always did when lives depended on it. During the war, he'd stitched men back together in the dark while artillery screamed overhead. This was quieter, but no less desperate. By the 10th sting, his shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool night air. By the 15th, his hands ached from the delicate work. By the 20th, he was questioning every cut, every squeeze, wondering if he was helping or hastening her death. When he'd cleaned the last wound, a nasty double sting on her left shoulder, he sat back against the cave wall, exhausted. His hands trembled now that the work was done. The knife slipped from his fingers, clattering against stone. He closed his eyes just for a moment, just to breathe. That's when he saw the brand. It was on her left shoulder blade, partially hidden by her torn dress. At first, Cade thought it was a shadow, a trick of Firelight. Then she shifted, and he saw it clearly. Burned into the skin, 2 crossed feathers, the Iron Raven's mark. The brand was fresh, maybe 3 days old, still raw and weeping. The skin around it was inflamed, infected. Someone had held hot iron against her flesh long enough to sear through the top layers to leave a scar that would never fade. They'd branded her like cattle, like property. Cade's hands curled into fists. His breath came faster, hotter. He'd seen a lot of evil during the war, men shot for sport prisoners, beaten until bones showed through skin, villages burned with families inside. He'd thought he was numb to it, thought he'd left that rage behind when he came west. But looking at that brand, at what they'd done to her, the rage came rushing back. Cold, pure, righteous. He'd walked away from the war because killing had stopped meaning anything. Every man who died was just another body in a ditch, another name forgotten by history. The cause, whatever it had been, had drowned in blood until nothing remained but exhaustion and ghosts. But this was different. This wasn't politics or territory or pride. This was cruelty for its own sake. This was men who'd taken a woman, a healer, someone who saved lives, and marked her like an animal. Cade had killed for less worthy reasons. He forced himself to look away from the brand, to focus on her other injuries. The dislocated shoulders needed to be set, but not until she woke. He'd need her cooperation for that. The rope burns on her wrists would heal on their own, given time and clean bandages. The venom was the real threat. And infection. He cleaned his knife in the fire again, then used it to cut strips from his spare shirt. He soaked the cloth in whiskey waste of good liquor, but better than gangrene, and wrapped her wrists, her neck, her arms where the stings were worst. By the time he finished, the fire had burned down to embers. Cade added more wood, then settled against the cave wall with his rifle across his knees. Outside, the desert sang its night song, coyotes calling, owls hunting, the wind sliding through stone like a long exhale. Inside, the woman Ayelen, he'd learned her name, was breathed steadily for the first time in hours. Cade told himself he'd close his eyes for just a minute, just until the shaking in his hands stopped. He woke to her gasping. Near midnight, Ayelen woke like a drowning woman, breaking surface, sudden, violent, desperate for air. Her good eye flew open wide and wild, her body arched, hands clawing at nothing. Cade moved fast, pressing the canteen to her lips. Slow, he said, his voice rough from disuse. You'll vomit if you drink too fast. She didn't listen. She drank anyway, 3 long, greedy swallows that made her throat work, made water spill down her chin. Then she turned her head and wretched body heaving. Nothing came up. She was empty. When the spasms passed, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, the gesture automatic, graceless, human, and looked at him. Really looked at him. Her eye was black as river stones, sharp despite the fever, despite the venom still coursing through her. She studied his face like she was reading a map, searching for something. Why, her voice was sandpaper on stone, barely more than a whisper. Why, what, why save me? She licked her cracked lips, winced. You saw the trap, saw the bones, saw what they do to people who help. Cade fed another stick to the fire, watching sparks spiral upward. Couldn't leave you. Men do. Her voice carried no accusation, just flat certainty. Every day. They see, they know, they ride past. I'm not those men. She studied him for a long moment, her eye moving across his face, the scar on his jaw from a rebel bayonet, the lines around his eyes from too much sun and not enough sleep, the way his hands never quite relaxed, even at rest. Finally she nodded, slow, deliberate, like he'd passed some invisible test. I am Ayelen, she said, each word costing her. Daughter of Chief Nakohi of the Sky Clan. Bearer of medicine. Walker between the living and the dead. Cade nodded back, matching her formality. Cade Mercer, nobody's son. Bearer of bad decisions and questionable judgment. A ghost of a smile touched her cracked lips, brief but real. The bad decision that saved my life. You're not saved yet. Cade gestured to her arms, her neck, the lingering swelling. That venom's still in your system. You need real medicine. Willow bark for the fever, yarrow for the wounds. Maybe golden seal if I can find it. I have medicine. She gestured weakly toward the pouch hanging from her neck, the movement making her wince as her damaged shoulders protested. Inside, small vial, white powder, mix with water, 1 pinch only. She locked eyes with him, and her voice dropped urgent. 1 pinch only. More will stop the heart. Cade opened the pouch carefully, aware he was handling something sacred. Inside, he found dried herbs. He didn't recognize small stones etched with symbols, a bundle of sage, a folded piece of deer hide that felt oddly heavy, and a tiny glass vial stoppered with wax. The white powder inside looked like snow or salt, fine-grained and pure. He unstopped. The vial tapped exactly 1 pinch into his palm, then mixed it into clean water. The powder dissolved instantly, leaving no trace except a faint milky color. He held the cup to her lips. Drink. She did, then immediately grimaced, her face twisting. Bitter. Most things that keep you alive are. You sound like my grandmother. But there was warmth in her voice now under the pain. Cade watched her carefully, counting heartbeats. If she'd lied, if the powder was poison, he'd see signs within minutes. Convulsions, foam at the mouth, pupils dilating. Instead, within minutes, her breathing eased. The rapid, shallow gasps slowed to something deeper, steadier. The swelling around her eye began to recede, not much, but enough to notice. The angry red of the sting sites faded to pink. Whatever the powder was, it worked faster than anything Cade had seen. Faster than morphine. Faster than whiskey or laudanum. Magic, some would call it. Medicine, Ayelen would say. Cade didn't care what it was called as long as it kept her breathing. Ayelen's eye closed, exhaustion pulling her back toward sleep. But before she went under, her hand moved slow, trembling, to clutch the medicine pouch against her chest. They will come for us, she whispered, her voice already fading. The ravens. They want what I carry. Cade leaned closer. The medicine. The map. His blood went cold. What map? But she was already asleep. Her breathing deepened. Even for the first time since he'd cut her down. Her face, still bruised and swollen, had softened into something almost peaceful. Cade stayed awake, rifle across his knees, watching the cave mouth, thinking about maps, about brands that marked flesh forever, about bones half buried in sand, warnings no one heeded, about what kind of map was worth branding, a woman worth hanging her as bait, worth killing anyone who tried to help. Outside, the desert wind picked up, carrying voices that might have been coyotes or might have been something worse. Cade checked his ammunition. 6 bullets in the Colt, 8 in the Winchester. Knife sharp enough to open a man from ribs to belt. Not enough if the ravens came in force, but maybe enough to buy time, maybe enough to learn what Ayelen carried that was worth dying for. He fed the fire 1 more stick and settled in to wait for dawn, wondering what the hell he'd gotten himself into, knowing somehow that he'd do it all again. Dawn came cold and pale. Ayelen woke to find Cade boiling coffee over the fire, his movements economical, practiced. He handed her a tin cup without speaking. She drank, grimaced again. You make terrible coffee. You're welcome. She sat up slowly, testing her body. The swelling had gone down significantly. Her eye was open now, both dark as river stones. Her shoulders still hung wrong, dislocated, but she showed no pain. I need you to set my shoulders, she said, matter-of-factly. I'm not a doctor. You were a soldier. You've done it before. She wasn't asking. Cade knelt behind her, placed his hands on her shoulders, feeling for the joint. This is going to hurt. Everything hurts. Do it. He counted to 3, then pulled and twisted in one sharp motion. The joint popped back into place. Ayelen's breath hissed between her teeth, but she didn't scream. Cade repeated the process with the other shoulder. When he finished, she rolled her arms, testing the range of motion. Good, she said. Now we talk. She retrieved the deer hide from her medicine pouch, unfolded it carefully. Cade saw symbols, lines, what looked like a crude map. This, Ayelen said, is why they hung me. Why they will hunt us until one side is dead. The map showed a canyon system with one location marked by a circled sun symbol. Eagle Cave, she continued. Where my ancestors buried the old chiefs along with. She hesitated. Copper, silver, turquoise, offerings to guide them to the spirit world. Treasure, Cade said flatly. Sacred objects. But yes, the white man would call it treasure, and the ravens want it. Their leader does. Colonel Silas Hammond. He has part of the map already stolen from a raid 3 months ago. This is the second piece. Without both, Eagle Cave cannot be found. With both. She folded the deer hide. He will loot my people's graves and sell everything to collectors in the east. Cade poured himself more coffee, thinking, why not destroy it, burn the map? Because my sister was taken in that same raid. She is Hammond's prisoner. The map is the only leverage I have to trade for her life. He'll kill you both the moment he has what he wants. Yes, Ayelen's voice was steady. That is why I need your help. Cade looked at her, this woman he'd known for less than a day, who'd already been tortured, branded, nearly killed, who was asking him to walk into certain death. He should have said no, should have given her a horse, pointed her toward friendly territory, and ridden the other way. Instead, he asked, where's Hammond now? 3 Peaks Camp, 2 days' ride northwest. And your people scattered after the raid. My father is in the White Mountains with the survivors. Cade stood, walked to the cave mouth, looked out at the desert, waking up under a sun that would burn like fury by noon. Behind him, Ayelen waited, asking nothing, demanding nothing, just waiting for him to choose. He'd made a choice like this once before at Cold Harbor, when his commanding officer ordered him to burn a hospital full of wounded Confederates. Cade had refused, nearly got shot for it, and spent the rest of the war in a punishment battalion. He'd told himself then, never again. No more moral stands, no more causes, no more dying for principle. But looking at the brand on Ayelen's shoulder, at the rope, burns on her wrists, at the defiance in her eyes that hadn't broken despite everything. Some choices weren't choices at all. We'll need weapons, he said, and a plan. Ayelen's face didn't change, but something in her posture relaxed. The ravens took my rifle, my knife, everything. Then we get them back. Cade turned from the cave mouth. But first you rest. Can't fight if you can't stand. I can stand. Can you shoot? She smiled, then sharp and dangerous. Better than you probably. We'll see about that. They spent the day preparing. Cade had a spare rifle, a Winchester repeater he'd won in a card game in Tucson, and a skinning knife with a 6-inch blade. Not much, but better than nothing. He showed Ayelen how to load the Winchester, adjust for wind account, for the rifle's slight pull to the left. She picked it up in minutes. You've shot before, he observed. The cavalry trained us well when they were trying to kill us. Fair point. By afternoon, Ayelen could stand without swaying, walk without stumbling. The medicine in her pouch had worked something close to a miracle. Cade didn't ask what was in it. Some knowledge wasn't meant for outsiders. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, turning the desert golden red, they sat outside the cave eating jerky and hardtack. Tell me about Hammond, Cade said. What kind of man is he? Ayelen's jaw tightened. The kind who burns villages to watch people run, who takes women not because he wants them but because he can, who wears a uniform like it gives him permission. He was military Confederate colonel. After the war he couldn't let go. Gathered men like him, soldiers who missed having enemies to kill, and came west. She paused. He believes the land belongs to whoever is strong enough to take it. Men like that don't negotiate. No. They take until someone stops them. Cade understood. He'd known men like Hammond officers who saw war as proof of their superiority, who mistook violence for strength. Your sister, he said. What's her name? Kaya. She is 16. Smart, stubborn. Ayelen's voice softened. She wanted to be a medicine woman like me. Now she is Hammond's leverage. We'll get her back. You don't know that. No, Cade agreed. But we'll die trying. That's worth something. Ayelen looked at him, really looked at him, and nodded slowly. You are not what I expected when I prayed for rescue. What did you expect? Someone younger? Someone with more hope? Cade smiled despite himself. Hope's a luxury. Ideal in stubbornness. Good, Ayelen said. Stubbornness keeps you alive longer than hope. They rode out at first light. Northwest toward 3 Peaks Camp, toward Hammond and his ravens, toward a confrontation that would end in blood no matter how it played out. But as they rode, Cade felt something he hadn't felt in years, not hope exactly, but purpose. Direction. The sense that his life had for this moment, a shape beyond mere survival. Beside him, Ayelen rode straight back, her face turned toward the mountains, toward her sister, toward a future that might include freedom, or might include death. Either way, they rode toward it together. And in the Wild West, sometimes that was enough. The desert remembers. The desert doesn't forgive. But sometimes, if you're lucky, it gives you a chance to rewrite your story in blood and dust and fire. This is a tale of cowboy love stories written in gunpowder, of Wild West stories that echo through canyons of Wild West love that burns hotter than the sun and cuts deeper than any brand. The story has just begun.